keep it real. And I'm, of course, Anthony Parker Alexander. We thank you for watching the show. Don't forget to hit the like and share button and subscribe. Let's keep the show going. We try to do things with a Parker twist. We try to get the left side. We try to get the right side. And at the end, hopefully what you get is the truth. You may not like how that truth is, but we try to follow the truth. We try to put things in a Parker twist. Everybody, speaking of twist, we're talking about Dr. King. It's that time where it's the I Have a Dream speech, blacks and whites get together, hold hands, and then after that, it's gone. What is a Dr. King federal holiday? Well, we're going to put things in the King experience, and we're going to talk about things that maybe people don't talk about besides the March on Washington. On this show, very jam-packed show, we're going to talk about the March on Washington, but not just the I Have a Dream speech from what we heard and a little bit of backstory, but we're going to give you a backstory about what took place behind the scenes, behind all these people. We think of Dr. King as a kind of solemn kind of guy, very thoughtful. But we're going to talk about some of the things that, well, made him happy. And we're going to talk about Coretta Scott King and her influence, because behind every good woman or behind every good man is a great woman. We're going to talk about some things that you just don't know about King. We're going to talk about some things that were tragic even after he passed away. There's his mom, and there's the guy that killed his mom. It's a very sad story. We're going to talk about the good times from the Kings. We're going to talk about the bad times from the Kings. That's a hard picture to show, and we'll talk about that in a part of the show. March on Washington, Civil Rights Act, right there. John F. Kennedy. Was this a political ploy, or did he really care about African Americans and minorities? We're going to talk about that. Another iconic picture. So we could go so much on that story. But when we think of the pictures, we just think of the ones that stay in our face that we always remember. And we're going to try to lighten up some of the pictures. Let's think about this right here. Isn't that beautiful? The March on Washington. That's where that took place. It was also where the Obama inauguration took place. And I was at the inaugural, for the Obama inaugural. Blacks, whites, arm in arm, everybody hugging each other. It was about maybe 15 degrees in the cold. We had to be there 5 hours before Obama was inaugurated and became president. That feeling. I would love to see how many people were there. And that March on Washington. And then how many people were at the inaugural for Barack Obama? If you were at both of those, let me know. Email address is parkerman2011 at gmail.com. Excuse me, parkerman2011 at gmail.com. I have a couple of different email addresses. Telephone number, you can text me 216-702-3718, 216-702-3718. So this is what I'm really excited about. So sit back, get some popcorn, and learn, because I have to learn. I'm putting all this easy for people, but it's in depth. So we're going to talk about some of the greatest speeches that weren't the I Have a Dream speech. We're going to talk about the March on Washington and how, man, the government thought it was going to be a race riot. We're going to go behind the scenes on that. Bernice King. There's a story out now that somebody has kind of, in her eyes, degraded her when they said to a female, be like Coretta. How many books have Dr. King written? You love his speeches, well, maybe it's time to read some of his books. What does Julia Roberts and the King family have? They have a weird connection. Speaking of connections, the sad connection of Dr. King and Malcolm X. They only met one time. One time they met. It could have changed the course of history. And facts and figures. I'm going to give you some facts about Dr. King that you may not even know. So stay tuned for that. And then some of the speeches, like I said, we're going to talk about that. But let's go. I think a lot of people, maybe some do, maybe some don't. The I Have a Dream speech was improvised. So halfway through his speech in 1963, gospel singer Mahalia Jackson shouted, "Tell him about the dream, Martin." And that call out prompted him to say, hey, you know what? I'm going to get rid of this previous sermon that I was going to deliver. I'm going to do my Have a Dream speech that I've done a couple times, but not really to a whole lot of people. And when he improvised and did that, he taught his whole speech, did that, bam, the rest is history. Another fun fact, his name, birth name, was Michael King. When born on January 15th, 1929, he was named after his father, Michael King. But 6 years later, King's father visited Germany and learned about Martin Luther, the leader of the Protestant Reformation. He was said to have been so inspired that he returned home and officially changed both his and his eldest son's names to Martin Luther King. Wow. So it was Martin Luther for 6 years, or Michael King for 6 years, and then he changed his name to Martin Luther. Well, the dad did. So for 6 years, he was Martin Luther or Michael King. And after his 6th birthday, he became Martin Luther King and Martin Luther King Jr. Wow. How many people knew that? So, you have any questions or comments? You know how to contact me. So we have these speeches too about Dr. King that he did that wasn't a I Have a Dream speech. And here is one before we take a break. This is called A Time to Break the Silence. And this sermon was delivered at Riverside Church in New York on April 4th, 1967. Why is this speech important? Now, this was King's most controversial speech ever. Even some members of his own group warned him not to do it. With this sermon, King decisively came out against the Vietnam War at a time when many Americans still supported it. Now, why did he do that? People were furious. President Johnson stopped talking to him. Civil rights leaders criticized him, and major newspapers told him to stick to civil rights. Yet King put principle over personal popularity, and he continued to oppose the war. 1 year later, to the day that he gave the speech, he was assassinated in Memphis. So what he said about in his speech, money that should have been spent on Johnson's war on poverty was being lost in Vietnam's killing fields. Dr. King said, a nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. So the speech distilled King's belief that racism, economic exploitation, and war were all connected as triple evils. The signature lines out of that speech. We are taking a Black young men who had been crippled by our society and sending them 8,000 miles away to guarantee liberties in Southeast Asia, which they had not found in Southwest Georgia and East Harlem. So we have been repeatedly faced with the cruel irony of watching Negro and white boys on TV screens as they kill and die together for a nation that has been unable to even seat them together in the same schools. Wow. Some people said that that speech was too radical. But we're going to talk about some of his greatest speeches too throughout the show. So sit back, relax, and enjoy, because you are about to experience the King experience. And we'll be right back after this. We don't just keep it honest, we keep it real. And you are watching the Dr. King Experience. Why we decided to call it like that different title, because these clips, these episodes, we're going to experience things dealing with Dr. King that maybe people may not have talked about. So everybody knows this scene where he did his Dr. King I Have a Dream speech. We know about the speech. We know how many people attended it, but we don't know the behind the scenes of what took place to make this happen. Amazing story. I'm going to tell you about it. So put your head back, close your eyes, and listen as we tell you the behind the scenes of the I Have a Dream speech. But first, if you have any questions or comments, you can give yours truly a call, 216-702-3718, 216-702-3718. And you can email me. It's parkerman2011@gmail.com, parkerman2011@gmail.com. So let's go back to this, 1963. Great event. The I Have a Dream speech. But how was it behind the scenes of this iconic picture? We remember the speech, the huge numbers, and the peaceful protest. Yet behind the scenes, the famous March on Washington in 1963, it provided suspicion, anxiety, and deep-seated fears in the White House that the day would end in violence. People thought this day was going to end in violence. So go back. Across America, Black fury had broken loose. Protests, racial shifts in Birmingham, Alabama, where police dogs, and if you've seen those pictures, they were crazy, had torn at the flesh of protesters. And they also had fire hoses on these people. So between May and late August in 63, there had been over 1,300 demonstrations in more than 200 cities. Some were communities long splintered along racial lines. Others had never before been touched by violence. They had never seen this before. The rampantness of the disturbance made it all the more terrifying. People were scared. Now, with over 200,000 protesters about to go to the nation's capital, there were fears that Washington itself could witness the same chaos and disorder. So for the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the untitled leader back then of the civil rights movement, the events of the early summer had transformed the struggle for Black equality from what he called a Negro protest into a Negro revolution. America, he felt, had reached explosive points. So you have African Americans feeling that they're not getting the rights, they're tired. And there's fighting between blacks and whites, blacks getting hosed down, arrested, demonstrations across the country. And now they're taking their way to Washington at the monument. So of course, the country was scared. Back then, the president of the United States was Kennedy. So issues which are not settled by justice and fair play will sooner or later be affected or settled by force and violence. This was Vice President Lyndon Baines Johnson. He was, as Vice President, had a different take on African Americans back then. The accelerated tempo of Negro restiveness, he warned, and this was the Black advisor, Lewis Martin, may create the most critical state of race relations since the Civil War. Listen how scary this is. Negroes are now just antagonistic and mad, and they're going to be mad at everything. You can't talk to them, he said. My friends all say, even the Negro maids and servants are getting antagonistic. Wow. So like I said, John F. Kennedy was president back then. So for most of his presidency, he had viewed civil rights as a political issue to manage rather than a moral question to champion. Some people thought that he was for African Americans, but back then it says that it was a political thing for him. To take on the South was to risk splintering the Democratic Party, then an angry group of Northern liberals who tried to straddle the divide. Nor did Kennedy, who was a cool kind of guy, He was famed or known for his cool detachment. He had a strong emotional commitment to the freedom rights struggle. So was it a commitment or was it a political thing? So now let's go to the summer of 63. Kennedy realized that his presidency might come to be divided by his responses to the racial crisis. And he was saying to himself, I have got to get involved. In June, the fires of frustration and discord are burning in every city, north and south. So do we have any of that now? But what did we have to go through to get to where we're at now? So now, a couple of days, right when the march on Washington, this is the plan. To get protesters off the streets, he had finally introduced a long-awaited civil rights bill that would begin to dismantle segregation, the system of racial apartheid that prevailed across much of the American South. Great time around us. But even after he had made his nationwide address and finally lent the weight of his office to the Black struggle, the protests and violence continued. So it's not stopped, it's not slowing up. A massive demonstration in Washington then was fraught with danger. When the administration learned midway through June of plans for the March on Washington, its first response was to pressure Black leaders into canceling. Hey guys, we think there's going to be a lot of stuff happening. Maybe you guys shouldn't do it. So at a White House meeting, Kennedy told Dr. King and other civil rights leaders that he did not want a big show on the Capitol because it would complicate efforts to enact the civil rights bill into law. When attempts at persuasion failed, the administration decided instead to try to wrest control of the demonstration. Here, the president was adamant, shockingly so. They're liable to come down here and crap all over the Washington Monument, he told aides. I've got a civil rights bill to get through. We'll run it. So the bill was trying to get through as they were about to do this March on Washington. So to prevent the demonstration turning into a massive race riot, Kennedy ordered a mobilization of the federal government security apparatus, unprecedented outside of wartime. Take this in. To start with, the FBI ramped up its already vast surveillance operation on the civil rights movement, which included electronic eavesdropping on King. It instructed every field office across the country to provide intelligence on how many local Black activists planned to converge in Washington and whether they had any affiliation with communist organizations. Back then in the 60s, they were trying to prevent anything from happening. An additional fear was that Black radicals who had rejected the nonviolent tactics of the more moderate civil rights, and who would say Malcolm X back then, would hijack the march. Almost 150 FBI agents were assigned to mingle in the crowd, working in tandem with Secret Service agents. Others were stationed at rooftop observation points. Now look at that, okay? Rooftop observation points on the Lincoln Memorial, Union Station, and the Commerce Department overlooking the mall. At the FBI headquarters, who director then was J. Edgar Hoover, and we know how bad he was, look it up. He feared might come under attack from protesters, and security was also tightened. Staff were warned to sit away from the windows. Wow. So now let's go to what happened a couple weeks before this took place. The prospect of violence also preoccupied the Washington Police Department, which was placed on the highest state of alert. It came up with no less than 72 potential disaster scenarios and plotted a response to each one. Wow. And here we go, a close-up. So look at that. What did they have to do to make sure this was a peaceful protest? And in the end, it was a peaceful protest. So it helped that the Lincoln Memorial was enclosed on three sides of water, okay? That way nobody can get around and try to do anything. But every corner of downtown Washington would also be protected. On Capitol Hill, a thin blue line of officers standing 5 feet apart would surround Congress. Wow. So a policeman or National Guardsman would be stationed on every corner in a downtown business district to guard against looting. To beef up the police presence, hundreds of additional officers were drafted in from neighboring suburban forces. who attended specifically organized riot training courses. They were really getting prepared for this. So many law enforcement resources were devoted to policing in March, the FBI feared a spate of bank robberies in the capital's outlying neighborhoods. So they thought since all the cops were converging here, there were going to be crimes across the city. None of that happened. Despite the massive mobilization, police dogs remained in their kennels. Mindful of the ugly images from Birmingham in May, where the photographs of young protesters being mauled by snaring dogs had shocked so many white Americans, their presence could easily incite a crowd. And you think of how blessed everybody was that nothing really took place. We kind of shrugged that off, March on Washington, as far as peaceful, but really what they had to do to make sure nothing happened. And in the end, nothing happened anyway. So because so many arrests were expected, a team of local judges were placed on round-the-clock standby in the city's courtrooms. At the District of Columbia's jailhouse, 350 inmates were evacuated to create space for disruptive protesters. Elective surgery in the greater Washington area was canceled so that more than 350 beds could be set aside for riot-related emergencies. And none of this happened. None of it happened. Look at this picture. Etch this into your mind. None of that happened. This happened, but none of the other stuff happened. Wow. The DC General Hospital even went as far as to activate its national disaster plan. Life in Washington was completely disrupted in the run-up to the march. And it may have been disrupted, but it still took place. And at the end of the day, was it better to be prepared than not? Because as you know, this is where I Have a Dream took place. Government officials were told to stay home, and there was a 24-hour ban on the sale of alcohol. Wow, the first time since Prohibition. So fears about the violent potential of the march also worried its organizers. They agreed to bring forward the start time so that protesters would not be left wandering the streets after dark. The original plan for a mass protest on the steps of the U.S. Congress was shelved. So they wanted this at the United States Congress building, which I think would not have had that full effect. Instead, they chose Lincoln Memorial, a more manageable and less politically sensitive site. And maybe that was their thing to place it there, because it's not a political thing. You place it in front of Congress building, it is. So even after weeks of planning, administrative officials could not rule out the threat of violence. So on March Day itself, the District of Columbia was placed under virtual martial law, with the president ordering the biggest peaceful military buildup in the United States history. Wow. Keep looking at this picture, keep listening to the words. And my camera, man, I think is so much into it that he's paying attention to the story. So on March Day itself, they had a virtual martial law. By mid-morning on August 28th, 5 military bases on the outskirts of the capital were bursting with activity as a heavily armed 4,000-strong task force with the code name Inside prepared for deployment. When they say pictures say 1,000 words, this says 1,000 words, but there were probably 1,000 people involved that weren't in this picture. So at Fort Myer, 30 helicopters had been flown in especially to provide a rapid shift capability, meaning those 30 helicopters would be there just like that. 15,000 Special Force troops were placed on standby, ready to be airlifted at the sign of trouble. If violence flared, speed of deployment was essential. Wow. If the violence continued, the president would sign an executive order authorizing the Pentagon to take all appropriate stages and steps to disperse the crowd. I wonder what that means. As a confidential memo put it, desire for use of minimum force must not jeopardize successful completion of mission. In response to an escalating situation, troops would first brandish unloaded rifles with bayonets, think about that, fixed Then, if it got worse, they would bear and show the bayonets. If that failed, tear gas could be used, and then loaded rifles would bear bayonets fixed. The mission went by the code name Operation Washington. So heavy was the military buildup that one reporter observed that the city was transformed from the capital of a nation at peace to a nation at war. So while you get all these people over here saying, I have a dream, out of the outskirts of the picture was President Kennedy and other people saying, okay, if this goes bad, so let's be prepared. So throughout that day on the March in Washington, President Kennedy, he was inside the White House chairing a meeting of foreign policy advisors on Vietnam. But you got all this happening in your city, right down the street, and you're doing something else. So ahead of the march, he had resisted demands from King and the other leaders of the so-called Big Six civil rights organizations for a presidential audience that morning, since he did not want to be identified too closely with a demonstration that might become violent. So he turned down the invitation from Dr. King and them because he didn't want to be one of the faces of this nonviolent protest. His advisors also warned that Black leaders would arrive at the White House with a list of unreasonable demands which the president would find impossible to meet. I wonder what would their demands have been if they left the Oval Office aggravated because they didn't get the demands. The whole tenor or tone of the demonstration could rapidly change. So maybe they shouldn't have got together, which they didn't. So much to the march organizers' disappointment, Kennedy, he also decided against sending protesters a presidential statement, fearing it would spark demonstrations against him on the mall. Because back then, race relations were pretty big. So if Kennedy would have supported this, then it might have looked bad for people who aren't really for civil rights laws. So instead, he agreed to host a delegation of Black leaders after the protest, hoping it would soften their rhetoric against him. So an administrative official was positioned to the right, okay, of the Lincoln Memorial with an automatic cutoff switch and a record turntable. And that's in case somebody says something in these speeches that wasn't that good. So he's got the whole world in his hands at this march. And even though it wasn't all King's march, it was all of the people that came there. So when you're there, and I'm curious for people that were there, did you know any of this took place? I know I didn't. So now let's go to close of the timing. At 1:40 p.m., West Wing aides wheeled a small television to the Oval Office, and Kennedy began to watch just as King was about to speak. Standing midway up the steps of the most magnificent pulpit that America could offer, the preacher looked out over a stirring audience of over 200,000 demonstrators stretching down from either sides of the mall. Wow. Thousands were stretched out on the grass, laying down, jammed elbow to elbow, while others waded deep in the water to escape the heat. Wow. So when I was there for the Obama event, I was somewhere around there. And even at the Obama presidency, it was pretty amazing. So you picture this, all these people, arm in arm, laying down, from in the water. So with Dr. King and the statue of Abraham Lincoln in the background, he started his speech. So as he was doing his speech, a lot of people weren't impressed with this. It was hot, speech wasn't going well, and who set them off that really started the I Have a Dream speech? Famous gospel singer Mahalia Jackson. As the speech was not going well, Mahalia said, tell them about the dream. So she shouted, referring to Dr. King's riff, where in some of the speeches he did a little bit of a Dr. I have a dream speech, and he told about the dream. And so when she said, tell him about the dream, he decided, okay, well, you know what? I guess they're not kind of feeling it, so I'm going to improvise. And he put aside his prepared notes and then started saying, I have a dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of his crowd, he shouted, his arm outstretched just like he said. Dream on, they said, dream on. And with all that enthusiasm and excitement, he started talking about, I have a dream, and went on. King asked the crowd to yell so it was heard the world over. So watching in the White House, like so many Americans, President Kennedy looked at this 34-year-old preacher deliver a speech to the country the first time he had taken his measure. And he thought about it, and he said, wow, man, this guy's amazing. He is really good. The aide was struck, however, that the president seemed impressed more by the quality of King's speech than what it talked about. So happily, the march proved anticlimactic. By dusk, there have been just 3 arrests. Think about that. All those people, 3 arrests, all involving white people. In the event, the only threat to police came not from unruly protesters, but the chicken box dinners handed out earlier in the morning. And the funny thing was, they said, hey, they told the officers under no circumstances should they touch the chicken. Starts with a dream, ends with a chicken. Wow. And after that, President Kennedy invited them to the White House. I have a dream. Wow. So hopefully you learned something from this. I have a dream, Dr. King. Maybe you were there. And if you were there, and also if you were at the inauguration of President Obama, same place, March on Washington, let me know. Contact me. 216-702-3718, 216-702-3718. Email address, parkerman2011@gmail.com, parkerman2011@gmail.com. And again, we keep it simple, keep it honest, and keep it real. March on Washington. What took place, not just there, but behind the scenes. And welcome back again. Yours truly, Anthony Parker Alexander, and you are watching the King Experience. Interesting that behind the scenes of that March on Washington, you're not just getting, wow, the picture of the March on Washington and the people there, but what took place behind it. With the information I gave you about President Kennedy, was it a political thing or was it a passionate thing from the heart that he was looking out for African Americans and other minorities? Let me know what you think. Great part of the show still coming up. We've had some good parts. We've got some even better parts coming up. Facts again about Dr. King. He decided to go to college. And when he went to college, that's when he decided to become a preacher. In 1944, Dr. King was admitted to Morehouse College at the age of 15. What a smart young man. Generations of the King family had graduated from the prestigious all-male, historically Black college in Atlanta, Georgia. And according to the King Institute, the future civil rights leader was said to have been an ordinary student Yeah, kind of like most of us. But his time at Morehouse was instrumental in awakening his passion for social and political equality and inspired him to become a preacher. Anyone, if I had a chance to interview him, I would ask him, what was that pivotal moment where you said, you know what, I just don't want to be a pastor, but I want to be a pastor for change. Wow. Speaking of him being so young, he became the leader of the movement at just 26 years old. In 1955, Dr. King was elected to the executive committee of the Montgomery, Alabama NAACP and president of the Montgomery Improvement Association. So think about this. When Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give her bus seat to a white passenger, King became the de facto leader of the Montgomery bus boycott and the modern civil rights movement. He was 26 years old. So let's go back to hypotheticals. What if? What if on that day, Rosa didn't have to go to work? What if she decided, well, you know what? I'm going to do what I normally have to do. I'm going to give up my seat. Some people think Dr. King was that prominent person of the civil rights movement, but Rosa Parks was there too. And you had those two forces combined. I don't want to sit on the back to a guy that was saying, you know what? She's fighting for something. I'm here to fight for something. And he put their tools together. And then the civil rights movement, it just moved. Wow, man. So what ifs? Another interesting one that I like. Always wanted to know, thinking out the box, that Dr. King, kind of a funny one. And I think even Dr. King would laugh at this. What did he do when he was private time at home? Did he watch TV? Did he watch movies? Did he go to the movies? What was one of his favorite shows that he liked? Well, he was a Star Trek fan. Right there is Uhura and Dr. King. I know some people know this story. So Uhura, better known as Nichelle Nichols, she was once introduced to someone claiming to be her biggest fan, Dr. King. So at that time in the early 60s, she had a groundbreaking role, African-American female, and they were at an award ceremony. So when she was there, she informed Dr. King that she planned to leave Star Trek. He wanted to know why. He said, you could not abandon this iconic role. And I guess she felt that, yeah, I mean, you know, she's Black, she's doing TV, but she's not doing what she wants to do. So he told her, Uhura, for the first time on television, we will be seen as we should be seen every day as intelligent, quality, beautiful people who can go into space. That's what she recalled. I just stood there realizing every word he was saying was the truth. At that moment, the world tilted for me. She would continue in this role for years, a couple more years because the show was on for 3 years. And I don't know what year that was that he met her, but he was a Trekkie. And it showed him and it showed society that, you know what, no matter what African Americans are going through now, boom, our future is as bright as anyone else's. Wow. An inspiration. Dr. King touched television, one of my favorite shows, Star Trek. You're watching, again, the King Experience with yours truly, Anthony Parker. Now, we know there have been a lot of books written by Dr. King, or written for Dr. King, too. And a couple of people I've had on the show, Cornel West, Dr. Cornel West, David Garrow, and David Garrow wrote a Pulitzer Prize book on Dr. King. And then Dr. West, everybody knows Dr. West. He's written in-depth stories about people, and King was one of them. So it made me wonder. We've seen Dr. King, we've seen him on speeches, we've kind of seen him on TV. But have we really read anything that he wrote? Well, after this, we're going to talk about some of the books that were written by Dr. King. And remember, we're keeping it honest, keeping it simple, and keeping it real. The Dr. King Experiment. And welcome back again, yours truly, Anthony Parker. We are, of course, keeping it honest, keeping it real, and keeping it simple. Now, the last break, we were talking about books. Dr. King has written kind of a lot of books, kind of surprises people. We see his videos, we see the pictures, but do we read anything what he talks about? So Dr. King, as eloquently as he talked, he also wrote. And he wrote about the things that were happening in the times that he was living in, which was very incredible. Some of the books, Stride Toward Freedom, The Montgomery Story. This came out in 1958 and is one of King's earliest works. Stride Toward Freedom recounts the Montgomery bus boycott. This was a very important event in the civil rights era. And so he wrote a book about it. This book dwells into the nonviolent strategies employed during the boycott, and it highlights King's role as a leader. It serves as a testament to the power of peaceful protest and the fight against racial segregation. Whilst as he was going through that with the Montgomery bus boycott, he was also writing a book. Strength to Love, 1963. It's a collection of sermons and speeches delivered by King during his ministry. In this book, he addresses various topics, including love, forgiveness, and the importance of nonviolence. It provides leaders with spiritual insight and moral guidance, showcasing King's profound understanding of social justice intertwined with his faith. So you have to have a lot of faith while going through the things that you're going through, and especially Dr. King. So it seems like a good book to read. Strength to Love, 1963. Why Can't We Wait, 1964. In this book, Dr. King reflects on the civil rights movement and its progress up until the mid-60s. Why Can't We Wait emphasizes the urgency of the fight for racial equality and highlights the need for immediate action. King's powerful work shed light on the struggles faced by African Americans and the importance of continued social change. And this took place again around the time of civil rights at the high, most intensive of that time. Name of that book again, Why Can't We Wait, 1964. My question, from there to now, where do we go from here, chaos or community? That was 1967 that King wrote this book. So published in the midst of the civil rights movement, this book explores the challenges faced by African Americans after the passage of major civil rights legislation. And I think this is around the time Civil Rights Act of 65 was passed. And so he wrote a book kind of about this. King discusses the need for economic equality, the Vietnam War, and the importance of unity among diverse communities. Where we go from here remains relevant in today's discussions on racial justice and equality. Yes, so that book, which was years ago, is still prevalent today. Where do we go from here? Chaos or community, 1967. The Trumpet of Conscience, I like that name, 1968. So this is a collection of 5 lectures delivered by King in 1967, a year before he was assassinated. In these essays, he addresses topics such as nonviolence, racial inequality, and the Vietnam War. King's insightful analysis of the issues plaguing social society showcases his unwavering commitment to justice and equality. And when he stepped away from racial tension to social injustice as far as Vietnam and the war, he became one of the most hated men around, which was sad because he did get a Nobel Peace Prize. Are there any other books attributed to Dr. King? Well, some of the books titles include A Testimony of Hope, The Essential Writings and Speeches of Dr. King, 1986, and the Autobiography of Dr. King, 1968. A lot of politicians, a lot of people out there, media, they tend to write books, children's books. So did Dr. King write a children's book? That's kind of funny. What do you think? Do you think Dr. King, through all that time, private, civil rights, makes me laugh. Did he have a time to write a book for children? So, the one book called My Daddy, Dr. Martin Luther King, was written by his wife, Coretta Scott, and she portrays King's role as a father and a civil rights leader. So, I guess if you're going to have a book written by you, why not have it by somebody you love? Coretta Scott King. Wow. You're watching The King Experience on yours truly, keeping it real, keeping it honest, keeping it simple with Anthony Parker. And so we also have speeches, some of the greatest speeches ever written by Dr. King that wasn't the I Have a Dream speech. So this one, The American Dream, and this sermon was delivered at Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta on July 4th, 1965. So why is this important? So we've heard about his dream, but just 2 years later, he told an audience that his dream had turned into a nightmare. King's sermon addresses questions that could have been snatched from today's headlines. Think of this. What is the living wage for workers in menial jobs? We still talk about that. Is income inequality as corrosive as racial injustice? Which one's worse, money or injustice? What are the challenges of preserving a multicultural democracy? What he said in his speech. King said that class divisions within the United States can be as vicious and evil as a system based on racial injustice. He also talked about the dignity of all work, saying that even menial workers should make enough so that they can live and educate their children and buy a home and have the basic necessities of life. Way back then, 65, still today, prevalent. Signature line out of the speech. About 2 years ago now, I stood with many of you who stood there in person and all of you who were there in spirit before the Lincoln Memorial in Washington. As I came to the end of my speech there, I tried to tell the nation about a dream I had. I must confess to you this morning that since that sweltering August afternoon in 1963, my dream has often turned into a nightmare. Wow. I've seen my dreams shattered as I've walked the streets of Chicago and see Negroes, young men and women, with a sense of often hopelessness because they can't find any jobs. I've seen my dreams shattered as I've been through Appalachia, and I've seen my white brothers along with Negroes living in poverty. And I'm concerned about white poverty as much as I am concerned about Negro poverty. I must confess to you this morning that my dream has often turned into a nightmare. Wow. That's pretty sad. 2 years after the I Have a Dream speech, Dr. King said he kind of felt like that dream was really a dream. Wow, man. You are watching, keeping it honest, keeping it simple, keeping it real. We are keeping it honest. The Dr. King Experience. If you have any questions or comments, you can email yours truly. It's parkerman2011@gmail.com. parkerman2011@gmail.com. You can also text me. That number is 216-702-3718, 216-702-3718. After this, we're going to talk a little bit about his wife, because as they say, behind every good man is a great woman. We're going to talk about her. We're going to talk about his daughter. we're going to talk about how people are putting the legacy, the gracefulness of Coretta Scott King in some of their situations that they've been in, and how Bernice, the daughter, didn't particularly like that. Okay, don't put my mom, almost like Will Smith, in your mouth. After this break, I'll explain it. We don't just keep it simple. We don't just keep it honest. We don't just keep it real. We keep it where you say, wow, can't believe it. So you're watching right here, the Dr. King Experience, where we're talking about stuff maybe you never heard about, dealing with Dr. King. And there's a news story out that I think, I don't really like the sound of that news story and the person that's doing it or that's talking about it, because it just looks kind of tacky. I get it. Right here. Bernice King, Jonathan Majors right there, and Coretta Scott King. So why is this story important? A lot of people didn't know about it. Why is the story important? Well, because the guy right there, he's an actor. He compared his girlfriend to, Coretta Scott King. Story goes like this. So Majors had mentioned Coretta Scott King twice. Once on a recording played during his domestic violence trial, and again in his recent Good Morning America appearance. So because he mentioned Coretta Scott King, her daughter, Bernice, said, I'm going to get involved. So she took to social media. She went on X after Majors mentioned his mom's name while addressing his girlfriend's support during his recent domestic violence case. While she didn't mention Major's name in her post, she wanted to remind people that her mother, a civil rights icon, wasn't a prop. Bernice said, she was a peace advocate before she met my father and was instrumental in him speaking out against the Vietnam War, she wrote. Please understand, my mama was a force. So her statements came a day after this guy's appearance on Good Morning America, since being convicted of a misdemeanor assault and harassment in an incident involving his ex-partner, Grace Jabari. At one point during the interview, the actor explained how he wanted the women in his life to be like Coretta Scott King. He also called his current partner, Megan Good, an angel. She's held me down like a Coretta Scott King. I'm so blessed to have her. So Bernice King's mother's name was also mentioned during the trial. They played an audio recording that they played in court. And the actor could be heard saying he was a great man and urged Jabari to be more like Michelle Obama and Coretta Scott King. When asked about his comments in the recording during his Good Morning America interview, he said, it was me trying to give an analogy of what it is I'm aspiring to be. These great men, Martin, President Obama, I need her in that case, Grace, to make the same sacrifices I am making. And that's interesting. So was he making a sacrifice when he mentioned he wants to be like those men? Now, when you're making a sacrifice, you're giving up something for something else. So you're trying to be a good man, but what are you giving up to be a good man? Just be a good man. Okay? And so Bernice, she was really upset about that. And she said, which I'm going to read about, she says Her mom was a force. And she wrote this in the Huffington Post in 2017, titled, "A Woman's Proposed to Be a King," which she talked about her mom's impact. And it's so interesting. Coretta Scott King, I guess she was really a queen. So here's that story that Bernice wrote. A woman proposed to be a king. My mother left her mark. Women and girls and all of humanity are better for it. Before my mother was a king, she was a Scot from Marion, Alabama, the daughter of resilient, righteous parents, Obadiah and Bernice, who drove the bus that transported my mom and other Black students to school. Coretta Scott was born to a woman who supported the community. Before my mother was a king, she climbed trees and wrestled with boys, and she won. Even as a child, Coretta Scott demonstrated that her gender would not deter her success, nor did it detract from her strengths. Before she was a king, my mother was a civil rights activist, a member of the NAACP and the Race Relations and Civil Liberties Committees at Antioch College. Coretta Scott was determined that her life would serve to lift others. She was already a woman of great character. Before my mother was a king, she was a gifted vocalist and musician whose skill and academic garnered her a scholarship to the prestigious New England Conservatory for Music in Boston. Coretta Scott's path to Boston exemplified her commitment to being a woman of excellence. Look at that picture. That's really a prestigious, esteemed picture. That's really a picture of a queen. Before she was king, my mother was a peace advocate, a courageous leader, and an accomplished artist. When my father, Martin Luther King Jr., encountered her in Boston, he encountered a whole woman, a woman of substance, a woman who, as the traditional Black Baptist church still sings, had a charge to keep, a God to glorify. Before she was a king, my mother was a peace advocate, a courageous leader, and an accomplished artist. Before she was a king, my mother had a purpose, and her marriage to a man who would become one of the most celebrated leaders in history further propelled her toward that purpose. Her life before she met my father contributed to the foundations for them to build a life and co-labor in the movement together. Of her, he said, she saw the greatness of the movement and had a unique willingness to sacrifice herself for its continuation. Her life with my father was remarkable, despite, let me say that again. Her life with my father was a remarkable display of consistency to purpose, as Coretta Scott King not only excelled as a wife, and this is interesting because she was a person who really people looked up to. You think if it hadn't been for Coretta Scott King, how much would we have had for Dr. King? Wow. Her life with my father was a remarkable display of consistency to purpose, as Coretta Scott King not only excelled as a wife and mother, but also utilized her diplomacy and gift as a singer to advance the movement. My parents were partners, and she was a woman at the forefront of activism for civil and human rights. After my father's assassination in 1968, my mother's life without my father would become the clearest and most prevailing testimony to the wisdom and fortitude which had been cultivated in her since birth. That same year, she founded the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Social Change in my father's birth city, Alabama. More than a monument, it is the official living memorial to Martin Luther King Jr. and was established to provide education and training on his nonviolent philosophy and strategy. With this King Center as her base, my mother pressed on to fulfill a role that changed lives in legislation. She was a woman who refused to surrender the regions of what she knew to be her assignments, even when male civil rights and business leaders tried to convince her that she should leave the work of building her husband's legacy to them. She began her journey as the architect of the King legacy. Wow. So even when people wanted her to step down, she did not. So this woman's work continued. As founding president, chair, and CEO of the King Center, Coretta Scott King, interesting, she tirelessly carried the message of nonviolence and the dream of the beloved community throughout the globe. She, along with other dedicated workers, committed herself to the dream of an MLK holiday becoming a reality. She was one of the stars of it. The dream was realized. The holiday solidified my father's worldwide influence and increased the desire of many to learn more about his life and teachings. Consider that the time of my father's death, a poll found him to be the most hated man in America. Wow. Why was he so hated? Hmm. We have something on that. So find that clip for that section and let me know what you think about it. Wow. My mother's efforts as the architect of the King legacy changed the way the masses viewed Dr. King. Imagine where Dr. King's legacy would be if Coretta Scott had not been purported to be there with him. Imagine if she had not been a woman on fire for social justice and for nonviolent social change. Imagine if she had listened to those who wanted to put her in a gender box and limit her ability to lead as a legacy builder. Imagine if she had not been willing to be arrested by and for something greater than herself. Wow. She left her mark. Women and girls and all of humanity are better for it. The best way to express our gratitude is by embracing the philosophy that my mother believed was the path to building the beloved community. In this critical moment for our global community, let us live nonviolence. The principles and steps of nonviolence, which the King Center calls Nonviolent 365, will help us build a more peaceful, just, humane world, beginning with each of us. As my mother stated, people who think nonviolence is easy don't realize that it's a spiritual discipline that requires a great deal of strength, growth, and purging of the self so that one can overcome almost any obstacle for the good of all without being concerned about one's own welfare. In their honor and for the holistic health of our global community, I acknowledge humanity to choose nonviolence. Wow. The legacy of not just Dr. King, but his wife, Coretta Scott King. And you think that the one guy that's an actor who killed his girlfriend will be more like a queen, be more like Coretta Scott? Well, if they're not like Coretta Scott, then you pick 4 partners and you're not king. You're watching, keeping it honest. Yours truly, Anthony Parker. We don't just keep it simple, we keep it honest and we keep it real. Let me know what you think about that. The legacy of Coretta Scott King. When they say behind every man is a great woman, she exemplified that. She wasn't just a king. She was also a queen. Something to think about. And you are watching, of course, the Dr. King Experience. And welcome back again. Yours truly, Anthony Parker, the King Experience. Speeches. We know the I have a dream speech. I'm reading some speeches and the significance of them that you may not have heard about, such as this one. Our God is marching on. So this was delivered on March 25th, 1965, while in Montgomery, Alabama, at the end of the Selma to Montgomery March. So why is this speech important? Our God is marching on. It is one of King's most electrifying speeches. So when a roaring crowd joins King in shouting glory hallelujah at the end of the speech, the march becomes a church revival. The speech was a combination of one of the movement's most brutal but critical campaigns. 3 civil rights activists were killed and other marchers were beaten at the Edmund Pettus Bridge. King gave his defiant speech while standing on the steps of the Alabama State Capitol in Montgomery, a city known as the cradle of the Confederacy. This was the high water mark of the civil rights movement. The Selma campaign was sparked the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Wow. So because of that, and a lot of politicians were being beat on that bridge, I think Washington said, you know what, there's too much going on. Let's pass this act. What he said, this is what King said. King praised the white clergy and lay people of various faiths who traveled to Selma to face danger with African American protesters. He said that segregation was on its deathbed and the movement must now be prepared to march on poverty. Signature lines of the speech. They told us we wouldn't get here, and there were those who said that we would get here only over their dead bodies. But all the world today knows that we are here and that we are standing before the forces of power in the state of Alabama saying, we ain't going to let nobody turn us around. I come to say to you this afternoon, however difficult this moment, however frustrating the hour, it will not be long because truth crushed to earth will rise again. How long? Not long, because no lie can live forever. How long? Not long, because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. So the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. So what others said about this speech, it marked the triumph end of the first phase of the civil rights movement, seeking legal and political rights, and the beginning of a new phase. Wow. Some people call this King's greatest speech and his greatest triumph. Now, I have always said, this is me, Civil Rights Act was passed. If you've been watching this show, we put a lot into the show, a lot of information. The Civil Rights Act, was it passed to pacify people, or was it passed because it was a movement that had to be done? My theories are, not a conspiracist. Everybody, African Americans, other people out there, were fighting to get rights for African Americans so much that the government said, look, they're fighting on this. Maybe ought to flip it. Maybe ought to give them that. And then let's see what else they do. Because once it was passed and people had their rights, it seems like quotas in the 70s, people got jobs because of quotas. That's a real thing. It's not a fake thing. And the people that got the quotas and got those jobs did not come back to help us out, the younger generation behind them. That's my theory. I could be wrong, but I've been proven right. And a lot of people don't like that, but I'm just keeping it simple, keeping it honest, and keeping it real. What if the Civil Rights Act hadn't passed, had not have passed? How hard would we have fought to get things? I believe again that the Civil Rights Act was passed to calm the community down until it was something bigger that they wanted to go after. You can let me know on that one. You got my number, you got my email. So as I'm putting my other stuff together, I want you to stay tuned for this show as we continue, because we got still a lot of hot buttons on this show. We're going to talk about Malcolm X, Dr. King. What if they never met? And how many times did they meet? We're going to study that. We're going to study who was the one that wanted to meet. Why didn't they meet? If you had two powerful civil rights activists at the same time, were the goals different or were they the same? If they were different but yet the same, meaning different avenues but wanting to come together, why didn't they come together? That was a lost cause in history. Still is the brunt of this. This picture right here. In September 1958, and King had had a lot of assassination attempts. He was approached by a mentally ill woman as he signed copies of his latest book, Stride Toward Freedom, in Harlem, New York City. So the woman verified that he was indeed King before stabbing him with a 7-inch blade. At the time, the doctor said he was a sneeze away from death. Wow. Because the knife was so close to his aorta, according to the King Institute. After learning the woman was mentally ill, King said, I bear no bitterness towards her, and instead called for her, wow, to receive treatment. Man, isn't that interesting? Dr. King's fighting everything. People try to kill him, and he still has a heart. Wow. What can you say? But the thing was in this next segment, we're going to talk about King, we're going to talk about X, we're going to talk about which one was humbler, because they both could have got together and made this world a better place. You are watching the King Experience. Alexander of keeping it honest. We don't just keep it simple. We don't just keep it honest. We keep it real. And this segment is one of my favorites. I've always wondered about this for many years since we were doing our Dr. King tribute. Right here you go. Two iconic people, Dr. King and Malcolm X. How many times do you think these two legendary people met up? Only one time. That's amazing. We had Dr. King, who was for peace, Malcolm X, who was by any means necessary, and they couldn't get it to work together. Wow. They only met once. I'm going to tell you the story. What happened? And this was at a press conference, and they didn't come there to meet together. They just happened to meet. And who was the one that went up to who as far as getting that meet and greet together? Was it Dr. King or was it Malcolm X? Let me tell you about it. So you know they always didn't see eye to eye. And when they did get together, how long do you think they met? Did they talk for a long time because they had never met? Did they talk short? Was it a couple minutes? Let me tell you the story. What happened? On March 16, 1964, Malcolm X and Dr. King, they met for the first and only time in Washington, D.C. Less than a year after that, Malcolm X was dead, the victim of assassination. So when you had the civil rights era going on in the 60s, how bad was it? You have Dr. King right here, you have Malcolm X on this side. Why didn't they ever get together? Well, part of it was because they had two different approaches. Backstory on them, though, both were born in their 20s. Dr. King was a son of a politically active preacher, and so was Malcolm X. King grew up stable environment, relatively middle class, and he lived in Georgia. His father was an NAACP organizer and leader, and King credited the loving atmosphere of his parents and his family for him to be that nonviolent person that he became. So now, Malcolm, born Malcolm Little, he experienced poverty and violence at a young age. His father, who was a supporter of Marcus Garvey, he died when Malcolm was only a kid at the hands of what his family believed to be white nationalists. Although highly intelligent, he dropped out of school, got around the wrong people, and eventually drifted into an area of crime. He was very intelligent. And what happens, unfortunately, and it's even today, when you get around the wrong people, it can make you so intelligent that you're stupid. And unfortunately, Malcolm was stupid because he got around the wrong people. So arrested at the age of 21, he drifted towards a life of crime. He was in and out of jail. Arrested at the age of 21, he was introduced to the Nation of Islam while in prison. So the group was also influenced by Marcus Garvey's ways of life and his thinking, and he became one of the most prominent disciples of Elijah Muhammad, the group's leader. So he decided while in prison to think about things. Sometimes people go different avenues when they're around certain people. And while he was in jail, he read all books. They liked what he said. He liked what they said. And then he was a voice and face for the Nation of Islam. So when you talk about King and you talk about Malcolm X, they clashed over, well, how do we make people treat us right as African Americans? Malcolm was highly critical of King's nonviolent way. But Malcolm said, hey, you know what? We need to get what we want. He felt that King was too slow in asking. And Malcolm said, well, let's not just ask, let's get. He often referred to Dr. King as a 20th century Uncle Tom. King, for his peacefulness, he kind of didn't like what X was saying and doing, and he felt it was dangerous. He kind of felt like, well, you know, he's urging Negroes to arm themselves and prepare to engage in violence, as he has done, and it can only reap nothing but grief. That's what Dr. King felt from Malcolm X. So you have these two guys, two powerful guys, X on this side, King on that side. Why haven't they gotten together to talk? So they tried it once before that meeting right then. Malcolm, he did make some effort to try to bring King and other civil rights leaders together. So in July of 1963, he invited King to a rally in Harlem. He called for a period of racial unity to fight white oppression. He was saying if Kennedy and communist Khrushchev can find themselves in common and find something in common on what to talk about, then it is a disgrace for Negro leaders not to be able to submerge our minor differences in order to seek a common solution to a common problem peered by a common enemy. So you think if leaders can get together who don't like each other, they can sit down. I give Malcolm X credit. He said, well, why can't me and you sit down and do our differences, try to solve it? So he put that out there because he invited him to the rally. So what happened with King? Did King say, okay, I want to do it or not, or they lost communication? Well, King never responded to this invitation. And neither he nor any other moderate civil rights leader attended that meeting. But here's somebody who you're calling radical, who's asking, hey, let's sit down and see if we can solve something. Where Malcolm X, and let's think about this, he went to the peaceful civil rights leaders and they pretty much didn't respond and said, we don't want to sit and talk. The invitation was there. Whether you like Malcolm X or not, the invitation was there. So in response, because of that, Malcolm X now, since he didn't get a response, he intensified his opinion of King, particularly the March on Washington. Now, you didn't know this, maybe you did, maybe you didn't. Malcolm X didn't attend that. And Malcolm X did not like that King did not respond, really, to the 4 girls killed in an Alabama church that same year. So it makes you think. Think about that time back then. African Americans were getting hosed. We had to sit in the back of the bus. We didn't have the right to vote. There's a lot of things we didn't have. But why couldn't we get the unity? Because there's enough power for everybody to get together. So on March 8th, 1964, and this is what I give Malcolm X credit for. He started deciding, hey, maybe I'm looking at things a little wrong. Malcolm publicly broke up with the Nation of Islam. And he kind of felt inside of himself, well, maybe there's a change coming. So here's that change. Let's go back to this picture. Malcolm X, Dr. King. Malcolm X, Dr. King. The one time that they got together. Now, let's talk about it. On March 25th, King and Malcolm were both at the Capitol Hill watching a Senate hearing regarding legislation aimed at ending segregation in public places and racial discrimination in employment. That's a big one. Again, that day, March 25th, King and Malcolm, they weren't there together. They just happened to be there. They were at the Senate hearing regarding legislation aimed at ending segregation in public places and racial discrimination in employment. This is a big time for African Americans. Who put this together? This had been proposed by President Kennedy following intense lobbying by King and others, and was being, I guess, spearheaded through Congress by President Lyndon Johnson. Despite harsh opposition by many Southern elected officials. Okay, so this was spearheaded by John F. Kennedy, who died early that year, 1963, November of 1963. So that year later, President Johnson said, I'm going to try to push this, what Kennedy wanted. So at this meeting, this would help segregation in public places to bring blacks and whites together where they don't have to, being African American, sit on the back of the bus and not drink at the same water fountain, and employment. So this is a big deal. So you have King coming to this. You have Malcolm X coming to this. They didn't talk together and say, hey, let's be a unified force to see how this goes. So as King was wrapping up a press conference, he was approached now by Malcolm, and the two shook hands now. Right here. Two shook hands. It wasn't King coming up to him, it was Malcolm. But the two shook hands. All right. And as cameras clicked away that famous meeting of these two iconic civil rights leaders meeting for the first time, shaking hands, Malcolm threw himself into the heart of the civil rights struggle. That's what he said. He wanted to become more active. He says, I am throwing myself into the heart of the civil rights struggle. And then as quickly as they shook hands, boom. It was over. The two legends, again, like Jordan and LeBron meeting up. And they're both saying, hey, you know what? It's good to meet you. Not, hey, let's unify this NBA environment. Two guys meeting up on the day that they're trying to get legislation passed for equality and employment for African American. And that's all you can say is shake hands. But Malcolm X says, I want to continue more in the struggle. But after the shaking hands and talking for a second, it was over. So 4 days later, opponents, they launched, think of this in the 60s, one of the longest filibusters in United States history to defeat the legislation. Wow. So it was defeated. But those two were together, and maybe they could have got it sooner. But it did eventually pass, and the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was signed into law on July second. But you can't say because of Dr. King and Malcolm X that it was done. You can kind of say that separately, but not together. So that April, this is the change now. Malcolm X went to North Africa in the Middle East. And when he went there, he kind of had a different position on how to do things in the country. He says, I was no less angry than I had been, but at the same time, the true brotherhood I had seen had influenced me. Wow. You think about that time away. It influenced him that anger can blind human vision. He went on to say, he believed America is the first country that can actually have a bloodless revolution. Wow. So now he's kind of looking at life a little bit different. Was that too late? So did Dr. King and Malcolm X ever get a chance to meet again? So in February 65, King and other civil rights leaders, they were in Selma, Alabama, leading a voting rights campaign. Malcolm now, he traveled south to deliver a series of speeches. So although he continued to criticize King, it's something I don't think a lot of people knew. He also met privately with King's wife, Coretta Scott King, stating his desire to work more closely with the nonviolent movement. So did she tell King, hey, you know what, honey? I talked to Malcolm X and he says he wants to work closely with you guys. He also noted that his attacks on King may have served a purpose, drawing the attention of, and this is interesting, of white Americans towards his more radical beliefs and approach, making King and his moderate positions a more acceptable alternative. However, here we go again. Malcolm X wanted to get together with him, but those two were unable to meet during his visit, as King and hundreds of others had been arrested days earlier while leading a protest march. So could Malcolm have said, you know, there's a march going on, I'm just going to go there and then talk to King? Or maybe he was busy doing, you know, his own stuff. And throughout this time, why did not King say, you know what? I need to maybe sit down and talk to Malcolm X. So even if he thought this, they didn't get together. Weeks later, Malcolm X was assassinated by members of the Nation of Islam, which supposedly he had left. So after, you know, they had a chance to get our country together for African Americans, and I'll tell you something about my commentary after this, but after Malcolm X had got killed, King wrote a letter to Betty Shabazz, Malcolm's widow. And this is what he said. While we did not always see eye to eye on methods to solve the race problem, I always had a deep affection for Malcolm and felt that he had great ability to put his finger on the existence and root of the problem. Wow. So in the years that followed, we know that King started, in some people's eyes, becoming more radical, not just talking about peace and justice, but talking about the Vietnam War and talking about the country's freedom and the economy and poverty. And he didn't just start talking about people in the African American community, but he talked about people overall. He talked about the war. He talked about the Vietnam War. He talked about why we're going to these wars, blacks and whites, together, fighting together to make America great again. But when we get home, we can't even talk to each other. So we need to put an end on this. And unfortunately, I have said, as far as change, for me, myself, who do you expect more? Somebody that's going this way, looking at things one way, or somebody that's looking at things one way and says, hey, you know what, let me think about this. And then says, hey, I might have been looking at things one way. I think this will make it better. Which one was Dr. King? Which one was Malcolm X? I loved King. I loved X. And it's sad and ironic that when Malcolm X said, no means necessary, by the end of his life, he changed that a little bit and said, well, maybe there are other means that are necessary to get to our common ground. Where Dr. King, where he wanted, let's talk peace and everything, by the end of his life, a lot of people didn't like the way that he was going. So he said, yes, it's about peace, but it's also about fighting for the rights and really fighting for the rights of what just not blacks or whites or any nationality, but everybody should have to make it work. Two different paths. Dr. King, Malcolm X. Ironically, at the end of the day, they could have made it work. Who knows if those two would have stepped together and instead of just shaking hands for a second, look at this now. Maybe they would have shook hands, talked, and said, hey, let's meet up. We're on this same train together, and we can make a difference. And if those two had gotten together at a time that they needed each other, where would this country be? Dr. King, Malcolm X. And you are watching the King Experience. We're reading speeches that aren't as well known as the I Have a Dream speech. This one, as I was looking at this, is called A Mock Eulogy. It's by Dr. King. And this was delivered just before the 1963 campaign in Birmingham, Alabama. And this is Dr. King with an interesting sense of humor. I had read that he was a very funny guy. So this is what this is. Let me know if you think this was funny. So why it's important, mock eulogy. Every hero becomes a bore at last. That quote from the 19th century writer Ralph Waldo Emerson could have been applied to King. With the rise of the Black Power movement, King seemed dull and obsolete to many people, many youth in the 1960s, because most of them preferred Malcolm X and the Black Panthers. They say King dressed like an undertaker and carefully measured each word in public. But King's mock eulogy reveals that in private, King had a wicked sense of humor. He was a man who was nicknamed by one of his top aides, Little N-word. Okay? He played the dozens. Can you picture Dr. King doing that? And he just did a lot of things that people just didn't picture. So this is what he said. The moment is grim. King is holding a meeting of top staffers in 1963, just before they initiate a campaign in Birmingham. He warns them that some may not return alive. Then he breaks the tension by assuring them he would preach a marvelous tribute for anyone who doesn't make it. He proceeds by delivering an over-the-top eulogy for one of his aides at the meeting, Andrew Young, who was often dispatched to negotiate with white leaders because of his non-threatening demeanor. Signature lines of this mock eulogy. Andy, when the Klan finally gets you, here's what I'll preach. Lord, white folks made a big mistake today. They have sent home to glory your faithful servant, Andrew Young. Lord, have mercy on the white folks who did this terrible deed. They killed the wrong in person. And Andrew Young, white folk had a friend so faithful, so enduring, they should never have harmed a hair on his head. Of all my associates, no one loved white folks as much as Andy. What others said about that at the time? He lived under the tremendous expectations of other people. So this mock eulogy was just a time for him to relax. Wow. The burden of dignity was always being proper because he was leading people. So this was a special moment, the mock eulogy. His preacher buddies could sit back, relax, and cut loose and renew their spirit to go on. What did you think of that? Sometimes people got to take a break. I guess back in those days, that was his way of taking a break. So we all knew about this. In this picture, where he did I Have a Dream speech. But this wasn't the first time that he was there doing the speech. He was there at the Lincoln Memorial in 1957. Unlike the 200,000 people that went at the first one, or the second one where I Have a Dream speech was, only 25,000 people gathered in the nation's capital. And this was a prayer pilgrimage. And the final speech of the day was reserved for Dr. King. Wow. Giving you a lot of information on the King experience, and hope that you guys have enjoyed it. Speaking of funerals, on his wedding day, right here with his wife. This isn't his wedding day, it's just those two together. He spent his wedding night in a funeral parlor. He married Coretta Scott in 1953 during a huge ceremony with 350 guests. Wow. They were at the Scott family in Alabama, and they represented the heart of the segregated South. And when the newlyweds were denied a room in a local hotel, they were able to be at a funeral party. Wow. When you're in love, you're going to do anything to get married. And you think about that. Back in those days, that had to be very crazy. Man. Another thing that's crazy, you think about King, his protesting and everything. How often did it wind him in jail? A lot. He was in jail a lot. In his 13 years, only 13 years as a civil rights leader, he was arrested 30 times, largely for misdemeanors and civil protest violations. He was often a target of law enforcement, as we know. He was arrested in October 1960 after a sit-in at a department store in Atlanta, and he was held in Georgia State Prison. He wrote to his wife saying that he hoped the excessive suffering that is now coming to our family will in some little way come to pass. Dr. King, he was everywhere. After this, have you ever heard of the Julia Roberts story where the Dr. King family helped the family out as far as the birth of Julia Roberts? There's a crazy connection with Julia Roberts' family and the King family. And we're going to talk about that after this. You're watching the King Experience. And welcome back again, yours truly, Anthony Parker Alexander. Keeping it simple, keeping it honest, and keeping it real. It's the King Experience that we're talking about. I love this story. It's a great story. Who would have thought A movie actress connected with the Kings. Let's picture, who could we think of? She's from Pretty Woman. We know her from there. Okay. Julia Roberts, you got it. This person right here. You're wondering, how is Julia Roberts and the King family connected? Look at that picture right there. The King family helped Julia Roberts because they could not afford a hospital bill. So the Kings got involved. And here's the backstory. When she was born, they didn't have enough money, Julia Roberts, so the King family helped pay the hospital bill for Julia Roberts' birth. Wow. So how does that tie in with anything? So in 1967, Julia Roberts' family, the parents, couldn't afford the hospital bill for her birth. So Dr. King and Coretta Scott King covered it. They have this interesting tie. How are the Kings able to connect with Julia Roberts' family? So this story, it was, I guess, a rumor for a while. And so what happened? It was confirmed by both Roberts and Bernice King on a show that was hosted by Gayle King. And it goes a little something like this. Gayle King, let's start with the day that you were born. Who paid for your hospital bill? Roberts. The King family paid for my hospital bills. Martin Luther King Jr., she says. Wow. And Coretta, says Roberts. Gayle King asked her, well, how did this come about? Why did they do that? Roberts. Obviously because my parents couldn't pay for the hospital bill. My parents had a theater school in Atlanta called the Actors and Writers Workshop. One day, Coretta Scott King called my mom and asked if her kids could be part of the school because they were having a hard time finding a place that would accept her kids. My mom was like, sure, come on over. And so they just all became friends and they helped us out of a jam. So Gayle King asked, in the 60s, you didn't have little black children interacting with little white kids in acting school. And your parents were like, come on in. And I think that's extraordinary. And it lays the groundwork for who you are. So then soon after the interview went viral, Bernice King shared the clip of Robert's account. So Robert's parents, Julia Roberts' parents, Walter and Betty, they ran a theater company, and King's other daughter, Yolanda, has spoken publicly about attending classes there. So there's a transcript that went to CNN. And on there, they continued the story because people just didn't believe that Julia Roberts was helped by the Kings. So October 28, 1967, Julia went home to a two-story house in Midtown, one of Atlanta's middle-class neighborhoods. Her parents again ran a writing and actors workshop, and Dr. King's kids were enrolled there. So Yolanda King said, Mr. Roberts was so imposing. I loved him, but I was also a little intimidated by him too. But he taught me so much, and he and Mrs. Roberts about the work and just about living and being really open, grabbing life and making the best of it. So Yolanda continues. Since age 8, she'd been enrolled in what was then the only integrated drama school in Atlanta, run by Julia Roberts' dad. She played in a teenage production of The Owl and the Pussycat in 72, she said. Her hometown erupted. So when she played in this, Yolanda said, I was 15, my co-star was white, and the white community criticized it because they didn't think mixing the races was right. This is in 1972. The black community asked, how could you disgrace your dead father's image by playing the role of a prostitute? So Yolanda, a little bit after Dr. King's death, acted 15 years old, played the role of a prostitute. A lot of people were upset. So they were so upset that on a Sunday at the church, he had to get up and explain about that, which was crazy to the whole congregation. So actor Philip DePoy, he described how a member of the KKK once attempted to make trouble for the aspiring actors. I kissed a girl, and 10 yards away, a Buick exploded. I was on the back of a flatbed truck that had been converted into a swamp. I was a fox. The girl was a terrapin. We were in Atlanta. It was a very nice summer day in '55, and I was 15 years old. And this took place in '65. It was a very nice summer day. The girl was Yolanda King, daughter of Coretta and Martin Luther King Jr. I was primary Caucasian, and Yolanda wasn't. That's what the trouble was about. I don't know who owned the Buick, but I know who blew it up. A member of the KKK, had been looking at me, and he saw me kiss Yolanda the day before in the same parking lot. She and I were members of the theatrical group called the Actors and Writers Workshop. Wow. It was run by the Roberts. So Yolanda and I were standing in a makeshift swamp on the back of a flatbed truck, dressed as a fox and a terrapin. The Klansmen had come around the day before the explosion in order to make trouble. Wow. The guy only heckled us the first day, said words that everyone had heard a million times before, finished his case, and was about to leave when I kissed Yolanda. The school eventually shut it down. And the Roberts, who helped the Kings, who helped the Roberts, they eventually divorced before Mr. Roberts' death in 1977. Wow. So Julia Roberts, and Julia Roberts also has a famous brother by the name of Eric Roberts, both minor actors. If you look at that, the interesting ties, no matter what, race is still at its base, but you have a black family and white family, no matter how hated they are for intermingling, they helped each other out. The Roberts family helped the King family get in the acting. The King family helped the Roberts family with the birth of Julia. Wow. I don't know if you heard that story before, but let me know. Text me 216-702-3718, 216-702-3718, or email me parkerman2011@gmail.com. parkerman2011@gmail.com. You're watching The King Experience. We keep it simple, we keep it honest, and we, of course, keep it real. I'm Anthony. Again, I'm going to tell you why I know that Dr. King is alive. Think about this. A letter, speech that Dr. King gave to this person, his wife, Coretta Scott King. It says, I am much more socialistic in my economic theory than capitalists. This was written on July 18th, 1952, to his future wife. Here we go, Coretta Scott, in which King reveals some surprising thoughts on capitalism and communism. Why it's important. There's a theory that King adopted more radical economic theories in the last 3 years of his life, but King's 1952 letter reveals he was radical far earlier than most people realize. what he said in this letter. The letter is an intriguing mix of the personal and abstract. King woos his future wife by telling her, "My life without you is like a year without a springtime, which comes to give illumination and heat to the atmosphere, which has been saturated by the dark, cold breeze of winter." Makes everybody look bad by saying that. Man, that's big. He then switches gears and starts praising a recent book on economics he has read. He says he would certainly welcome the day to come when there will be a nationalization of industry and a better distribution of wealth. Signature line from this. I imagine you already know that I am much more socialistic in my economic theory than capitalist. And yet I am not so opposed to capitalism that I have failed to see its relative merits. It started out with a noble and high motive to block the trade monopolies of nobles, but the most human systems it falls victim to, the very thing it was revolting against. So today, capitalism has outlived its youthfulness. It has brought about a system that takes necessities from the masses to give luxuries to the classes. I like that. What others say about this letter? King steered towards socialism early on. Wow. He's speaking about the need for the demise of capitalism, the need to nationalize industries. Early on, he has this dream that equality won't happen in America until there's a radical redistribution of wealth. So this is what he wrote to his wife. Wow. Future wife, man. So he seems more radical here. And if he'd have kept that, I would have changed how his outlook would have been. He would have been before Malcolm X. But somewhere down the line, he kept that inside and became more of a peaceful man. But at the end of his life, he said, okay, well, we have to fight, not fight physically, but we have to do a little bit more fighting to get our message across. So it seems like he didn't really believe in I Have a Dream speech himself. He felt like, well, what I dreamed was a wrong dream. Is it today? Was it today? So we're gonna, as I say, keep it simple, keep it honest, and of course, keep it real. Dr. King was assassinated on April 4th, 1968. You know this picture. That shot supposedly came from over there. But what we don't know was that a second person at the hotel where King was shot was slain. So this hotel is known as where King stayed. So when King was shot on the balcony in 1968, the rifle blast caused Lori Bailey, the hotel's co-owner, to have a stroke. Wow. Nobody talks about that. She died on the day of King's funeral. The hotel later became the National Civil Rights Museum. How many people know that somebody else died that day? That person had a heart attack. Wow. South Carolina was the last state to recognize the holiday. So back in 1992, South Carolina lost a chance to host the Super Bowl because they did not want to pass Dr. King's Day. Ronald Reagan passed it into 1983. That's when the holiday was passed. However, South Carolina said, I'm not going to do it. It finally recognized the federal holiday in 2000, the same year that it removed the Confederate flag from the Capitol dome. It took them 17 years to say, okay, we're going to give Dr. King this holiday. Wow. Yeah. So where were you at when Dr. King died? You think about that day. That was a rough year. Robert F. Kennedy died. Dr. King died. And sometimes when we don't look at the past, we tend to repeat things. And as much as things have changed, we've had a Black president 2 terms. Worst of times, a lot of people now. Seems like a lot of people aren't fighting that fight. Maybe we should go back And remember, how many people sacrificed to get to the right, to even vote? A lot of people aren't voting. And as I keep it honest, keep it real, Dr. King was killed, and so was his mom. Little known fact, let me know if you know it. In 1974, Dr. King's mother, Alberta King, she was playing the organ in church when a mentally disturbed African American man claiming to hate all Christians pulled out a gun and shot her to death, along with another member of the church. So, wow, man, Dr. King was killed, and so was his mom. And she was in a church by a Christian and an African American person who was mentally ill. And if I'm correct, the King family, I think they might have forgiven him. So the legacy of Dr. King, you drive up and down, man, you see a Dr. King, Dr. Martin Luther King street, literally everywhere. 900 streets have buried his name in the country. And it's interesting. Some of those Dr. King streets, I know of one. The surroundings, it's poverty and places where Dr. King would have been fighting. Some of those streets that are named Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. are some of those streets also impoverished with poverty. Wow. So some of the good things that have happened. July 2nd, 1964, there's King right there. He was there when President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act. So this is what this law means. Now, 1964. That's what, 60 years ago, 1964. The law prohibits discrimination based on race, sex, color, national origin, or religion. Today, it protects everything from our right to vote to our right to access public places. So Johnson said, the purpose of this law is simple. It does not restrict the freedom of any American so long as he respects the right of others. It does not give special treatment to any citizen. It does say that the only limit to a man's hope for happiness and for the future of his children shall be his ability. He used 75 pens to sign it into law. He gave one of the pens to King, who described the new law as a second emancipation. The ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands at times of challenge and controversy. Martin Luther King Jr., From Strength to Love, 1963. Another thing of happiness. On October 14, 1964, Dr. King became the youngest person in history to win the Nobel Peace Prize. He was 35 years old. When news broke, he happened to be getting a checkup at St. Joseph's Infirmary in Atlanta. Dr. King said that every penny of the prize money, which at that time was $54,000, would be given to the civil rights movement. It was a triumph moment signifying that people around the world were listening to what was going on in the United States. For many years, we have had to contend with the other side, Coretta said. For something like this to happen makes it all worthwhile. I believe that unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final word in reality. That is why temporarily defeated is stronger than evil triumph. And that's Dr. King accepting the Nobel Peace Prize, December 10, 1964. Wow. So let's go back to the good days. Dr. King and Coretta Scott. What a couple, what a legacy. Man, you think about King, you think about what he's done, he may be remembered, but I Have a Dream speech, which we talked about. But he did so much more. Let's look at him when he's happy. And remember, I Have a Dream is not just wasn't his dream, but it was our dream. Again, the sad thing was that By the time of his death, he was one of the most hated people in the world. But you look at decades since, we have a holiday. Took a while, but we have a holiday for him. Let me know what you thought of this program. You have been watching, of course, as we say, the King Experience. Let me know if you liked it. Let me know if you have any questions, comments. Let me know if this was something that you learned about, something that may have, you may have seen things so much with a Parker Twist, we try to change everything. I had said earlier, I believe Dr. King is alive. I have proof. And you're wondering, well, he's been dead for a while. No, he hasn't been dead. I'm going to give you the reasons why Dr. King is alive. I know it, you know it. Think about this. When we don't have to sit in the back of the bus, Dr. King is alive. When we can drink at the same water fountains, Dr. King is alive. When we can literally go into any store without it saying no Negroes allowed, Dr. King is alive. When we can see a Black lady on TV in the 60s, and Dr. King tells her to keep on, and she does, Dr. King is alive. When we've had a president, African American president, not one term, but 2 terms, Dr. King is alive. When we see more African Americans stepping up, then Dr. King is alive. When we believe that we have the same beliefs that Dr. King did, and it's inside of us, and we're doing it, then Dr. King is alive. So, as I close my arguments, Dr. King is alive. I have a dream, you have a dream. And I pray we reach that dream together, all uniformed. Because if we don't, then Dr. King's dream is not alive. Again, look at that. Beautiful. Man. If you have any questions or comments, you can email yours truly, parkerman2011@gmail.com, parkerman2011@gmail.com. And you can text me, 216-702-3718, 216-702-3718. You have been watching Keeping It Honest with yours truly, Anthony Parker. We don't just keep it simple. We don't just keep it honest. We don't just keep it real. We keep it for you. I'm Anthony Parker. You've been watching the Dr. King Experience. We'll talk again. And of course, God bless.